Hello and welcome to the channel, Master of Time. Welcome to another video. And today we're going to talk about dopamine and why should you care. I guarantee you that the information I'm going to share in this video is going to be more important and more relevant than you think. So stick around because it's time for you to actually get a pen and paper. It's going to be very informative, this video. And not necessarily a very easy lingo, but I guarantee you that you're going to understand why you need to care and understand about dopamine. So stay with me because it's going to be worth it. So the very basic question is, what is dopamine? Well, in technical terms, dopamine is a neurotransmitter. We have neurons inside of our brain, right? You probably saw the picture of neurons, in a scientific paper or in the news. In between these neurons, there's a gap, right? And dopamine is actually transmitted or released in between these gaps. And it's important to know this because neurons, they transmit electricity right in between our neurons, and they are responsible for our emotions, responsible for our feelings. So it's very important to understand this. And dopamine is naturally released by our body. Our body is always producing what is called a baseline dopamine level or baseline dopamine release, right? And dopamine can be released, like I said, naturally by our body, but it can also be released by experiences, by substances, which obviously drugs are one of them, by things we eat, things we consume, things we drink. So dopamine can be released in various forms. And you probably heard about dopamine being the hormone of pleasure or the hormone of reward, because dopamine is associated with reward. In ancient times, dopamine was related to, and still is, to motivation. And motivation is what? It's motive to act, right? So dopamine helps us as a motivation to act. In ancient times, we needed motivation to basically do what we needed to do to survive. We needed to gather, we needed to hunt, we needed to eat, we needed to find shelter, we needed to find a mate or a companion. And dopamine helped people in ancient time to actually have the motivation to do those things. So in this sense, it's important to understand that dopamine not only causes us the want to have something, but also triggers the motivation to go and get it. This is why I told you in the beginning, this video is so important for you to understand about dopamine. Again, I'm going to repeat myself. Dopamine is not only important because it gives us the pleasure, it gives us the reward, but it also produces the want to do that. And it's interesting because there is a scientific research that was done on a mouse that they inhibited the production of dopamine inside the mouse's brain. So the mouse was not producing dopamine naturally, right? And what it causes was really astonishing because the lack of dopamine triggered in the mouse a lack of survival instincts. What do I mean by that? They would put food in front of this mouse, or like inches away from this mouse, and the mouse lacked the motivation to go and get the food. Imagine that. So the lack of dopamine triggered the lack of motivation for the mouse's survival. This is why it's so important to understand about dopamine, because dopamine is not only about, oh, I need it because I need to understand about reward, about pleasure. No, it's about survival. And because we were made to be eternal seekers, right? We're always seeking for things. We have a big problem in today's world, or today's society, if you will, which is everything is very easily available. And that's one of the biggest struggles that we have as a society, is the the availability of things and how much and how big and how intense things are. So the biggest problem, if you think about it, is that everything is so readily available and the effort that we need to get it is so little. You see like how it got inverted. In ancient times, we needed dopamine to go and get it. The effort to get it was intense, was hard, right? Because you needed to go and hunt for food, for example, right? So the effort was big, and the reward was little or adequate, right? Now the effort is very little, and the reward is big, is intense. And dopamine is also responsible for measuring how intense or addictive an experience or a substance is, because this is measured by the speed and the amount of release of dopamine, right? So the higher the dopamine release, the faster it is, you guessed, the more addictive the substance is. Take a look at this diagram here that I got from the book called Dopamine Nation by Anne Lemke. It shows exactly how dangerous the substances nowadays are in comparison to the release of dopamine. So you can see here in this graph that the release of dopamine expected when you eat chocolate, for example, it's 55% increase of dopamine, and with the use of a drug like amphetamine is 1,000%. No wonder why people get addicted. And I'll share with you one of the most significant findings in the last 75 years in neuroscience is the fact that pleasure and pain, they found that, they discovered that the pleasure and pain are co-located. What does that mean in the brain? The same part of the brain is responsible for pleasure and is responsible for pain. Why does this matter? It matters because of something called homeostasis, which is our body's natural need to balance things. So as a clear example, if pleasure and pain are two sides of a scale, imagine a scale, right? If pleasure and pain are two opposite sides of this scale, it means that if you're experiencing pain or intense pain, pleasure can be go up, and if you're experiencing intense pleasure, pain goes down. So if pleasure and pain are like two sides of the same scale, it means that if one is tipped all the way down, the other goes all the way up, and vice versa. And our body is always seeking a mechanism or a way to balance things out. This is what is called homeostasis. A very clear example would be someone that gets high after consuming alcohol, for example. Well, the other side of the balance is the pain that comes with hangover, right? So that's the body trying to get into that balanced state, right? You have a high of pleasure with the consumption of alcohol, but you have the low, when the pain scale is tipped up, you have the low, which is the hangover. Craving, for example, is using this the same example of the balance, is when pain is tipped to the high, to the upside, right? And the pleasure is low. So in order for the body to go into a balance, the craving triggers what? The consumption of that thing or the behavior or the food, whatever it is, in order to balance things out. So you have craving, pain is high, and the craving is the trigger for you to consume something that will bring the pleasure up. And the thing is, not everyone's balance is equal the same. That's a big issue because, for example, people with anxiety, with depression, their balance is tipped more to the pain side. And this explains why usually people with psychiatric or depression, related issues, they have more of a tendency for addiction because the pain scale, the pain side of the scale is more tipped to the too high, so they're feeling more pain than usual, than normal people, instead of being in balance. So in essence, these people that have addiction, they're always seeking for things to balance the scale that is tipped to the pain side. Just to stay normal, they are seeking things to balance that. So that's so you understand the addiction behavior. Let's quickly talk about reward anticipation and reward response. So reward anticipation is the release of dopamine that you get when you're anticipating something, a behavior, eating something, drinking something, anything to that you will act, that will release that dopamine. Okay, so that's the anticipation. Now, the reward response is the release of dopamine you get when you actually do that thing, when you actually perform that act, or when you eat that food or you drink that. So that's the reward response. And this is why today we have an issue today, because nowadays things that are highly triggering both sides, both the anticipation and the response. As an example, people that are addicted to social media validation, they have the jolt of dopamine that is released with the anticipation after they post something. What is the anticipation? The anticipation for the number of likes, the number of views, the metrics, right? So they have that spike of dopamine for the anticipation, and they have another spike of dopamine with the response. When the notification starts coming, the likes, the comments, etc. So it's very easy to see, right, that the issue of dopamine nowadays is very different than in the ancient society or in ancient times, because the issue that we had in ancient times were scarcity, right? Scarcity of these pleasurable experiences, or that we had to actually do a big effort in order to have that release of dopamine, right? Nowadays, the issue and the problem is the abundance of those things. It's so easy to get a jolt or a spike of dopamine because there are so many things that are highly releasing dopamine all the time. And you can ask, like, what is the problem, the real problem that we have into giving in to this hyper release of dopamine? And I'll tell you, the issue is that our brain is a very smart brain. It's created by God in a perfect way. Our brain has this neuroadaptation that we can also call tolerance. What is tolerance? Is that when an experience that you've consumed for some time is not enough, the same intensity, the same level or quantity is no longer enough because you built that tolerance. So the issue is that the amount of pleasure decreases and the after response of pain increases. And this will lead to a deficit, a dopamine deficit state, which means that the reward that you were getting is no longer effective or enough. And you know what happens next. You start seeking for more, higher intensity, intense experiences, things that are going to give you more of that pleasure, more of that dopamine high. That's when you get into overstimulation, when anything, it's just not enough. And it's a huge problem that we all face nowadays. And it's a big issue because you don't have the expected reward of consuming that thing anymore. But if you don't consume it, you get the pain of it. You see how unfair it is, because you're expecting a high reward. You're no longer getting that high reward because of tolerance, right? That this neuroadaptation. But if you don't get it, the pain goes up, and you start feeling the pain. We became a society now where we need more things to feel pleasure and less things to feel pain. This is a phrase that I liked in this book called Dopamine Nation by Anne Lemke. So think about this. We need more to feel rewarded to feel pleasure, and we accept less, or we need less to feel pain. So we are too sensitive in a sense for pain, and too accustomed or too used to pleasure. And if you have your eyes, your mind dominated by the world outside, this is a never ending pursuit. It's never ending, it's never going to be enough. Now, is there a possible solution to this? Well, medically speaking, judging by the researches that Anne Lemke and other doctors did, yeah, there is a solution for this dopamine problem, and the solution is a dopamine fasting. What is dopamine fasting? Is when you intentionally start reducing your exposure to the experiences that produce high dopamine release in your life. And we all have different lives, we all have different needs. For some people, a high dopamine release will come from scrolling on social media, and that's an addictive behavior, obviously. For other people, which is more dangerous, comes from illicit drugs, or maybe even licit drugs, but they're not good for your health. And according to some clinical experiences, this fasting period, the ideal fasting period is 30 days. Why 30 days? Because that's the amount of time that usually takes for your reward center of dopamine, right? The pathways to release dopamine, they reset itself. It takes about 30 days, okay? So if you are having issues and you feel that you're having issues with too much dopamine, or you're feeling that nothing is giving you pleasure anymore, so that means that you probably have an imbalanced dopamine release pathway. So you need to reset that. You know what we need? We need to really learn how to self-bind. What does that mean? We need to create artificial ways, intentionally create artificial ways to prevent these behaviors, or to actually bind ourselves from doing these things that are damaging our brain, producing too much dopamine, tipping the scale in a way that is not healthy. So we have to artificially create barriers between ourselves and the behavior that is producing that dopamine spike, the behavior that is producing the overstimulation, whatever it is. For some people, like I said, overstimulation comes from behaviors like social media addiction, shopping addiction, drugs, alcohol, etc., etc. So whatever is causing that overstimulation, you need to reframe yourself from doing it. And that's what is the self-binding means. You need to intentionally stop doing that. You create a scenario where you actually preventing that from scaling up, that behavior or that dopamine release from scaling up and messing up with your internal balance. I hope you enjoyed this sort of deep dive on dopamine, and I hope I made my point across, which is it's important for you to understand about dopamine. You don't need to understand like a scientist, but understand the kind of behaviors that is leading you to cause spikes of dopamine, which is not healthy. Nowadays, especially, you have to be very mindful that the experiences, things around you are meant for that spike of dopamine, because the companies that are producing things such as social media apps, online gambling, all those things, they know what a spike in dopamine will do, which is causing an addiction, right? And that's unfortunately that's what they want. So you need to be mindful, you need to be aware that these things are happening, and only by being aware you can change these behaviors, and I'm sure you can do it. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Have an amazing and blessed day.